going to talk first. Oh, thanks, Will. We can't find a clicker, so it's a little awkward up here. I'll just have to kind of lean over this laptop and we'll go for it. So, punching? Oh no, I didn't want to go that way. Sorry. He gave me an apple and I haven't used one before. So this talk is on Science Society. It's an invited symposium for SPR, and I'll give you a little bit of history about how this symposium came about and what it's based on as we go through my presentation. We'll be a little quicker than the others so we can get to the meat of things. So transforming and scaling up community-level systems to achieve socially significant outcomes for at-risk children and families. I'm going to go ahead and introduce the speakers initially. So I'm Diana Fishbein, but everybody calls me Denny, and I'm at the University of Maryland School of Medicine. And we will also have speaking people from, basically what we're trying to do is simulate the translational spectrum. So we have talks that really kind of span from basic science. I'll touch on it just a tad to indicate why it's even important that we think about these things. And then we'll go to Mark Greenburg, who is a Bennett Chair from Penn State University, who really kind of spans a number of T's, if you will, a number of translational science areas. So T1, T2, and to some extent T3, and I'll define those for you shortly. And then we'll have Will Aldridge, who is at the National Implementation Research Network, part of UNC. And then we'll have Brian Bumbarger, who's the director of the EPIS Center, and he's Assistant Director for Knowledge Translation and Dissemination Prevention Research Center for the Promotion of Human Development. So I'll start by talking about how all of this originated and why it's important. So I'm just pushing.
These arrows down there.
Arrows and arrows. Okay, unfortunately, I think there's no clicker up here, so I have to kind of lean over this laptop. So here's the state of the science. I always say, we don't know enough, but we know enough. And it kind of gives me a job for the rest of my life to say that, but we don't know enough in terms of how to reliably improve behavioral outcomes for long-term for specific subgroups of individuals that we focus on. So this is really the plea for more research, and a particular kind of research, in order to answer some of the questions that we still have in the field. So even model prevention programs, even our best programs, only produce small to modest effect sizes. And that means we really don't know enough about what makes these interventions work. We don't know why favorable respondents, why they respond favorably. What are the mechanisms that can help to explain that? And we certainly don't know why there's a heterogeneous subgroup of individuals that don't respond well. And I say heterogeneous in that they're not alike, and they have characteristics that are variable and that can interfere with their ability to respond well to intervention curricula. And we need to understand what it is that they're responding to and what they're not. So what underlies these poor outcomes is a very important question, and we certainly need a great deal more research. And we're going to propose that a model to do this research that differs from traditional approaches. So we do know that because of this situation, a lot of program recipients don't do well over time. And this is, we're talking here about prevention of various kinds of risk behaviors. I know a lot of people at SPR have been a member of it practically since it originated. I'm dating myself now. But, are interested in drug abuse, but we're also concerned with obesity and gambling and a whole host of behavioral outcomes, in addition to disease. And so we don't want to discriminate in terms of the kind of outcomes we're interested in, because it's important to note that many of our preventive interventions actually affect the whole range of these outcomes. So we're not only talking about risk behavior out there when people turn into teenagers, we're talking about, you know, a whole developmental spectrum of behaviors in different domains that lead to these outcomes. And it even includes cardiovascular disease and diabetes and so on and so forth. So it's very important that we understand better how our programs work so that we can make them work for more people. In my program of research, the important question is what works best for whom, which is really moderation, why, which is mediation, what's mediating the program effects, and under what circumstances, which are the contextual and experiential factors that interact with these mechanisms and influence ultimate outcomes. This is just one example of how we're not having the impact that we had hoped after all these decades of research and billions of dollars poured into these programs. I don't have a clicker, but there's just very little dent in the use of alcohol in teenagers. Quite a bit more in cigarettes, and there's been a tremendous, public service and in public health policies and so on around smoking that have taken decades to have an effect, but it has had a significant effect. But with illicit drugs, we really haven't made a dent. So we need to start thinking about different models for our research. So proposing, I'm just going to put this all up because it's too hard for me to lean over and talk. Proposing that we apply a system science approach where we can catalyze integrative approaches. And when I say integrative, I mean numerous disciplines. Transdisciplinary means that disciplines across the spectrum of those that are relevant to our outcomes come together and have an integration in perspective and approach. Not a compartmentalization, not, you collect the saliva and I'll do the MRI and somebody else will do the behavioral assessments, but there's really an understanding of a common theory, a common model to work from, and it's integrated so it can really have a much more impactful effect on the phenomena under study. So we want to elucidate underlying pathophysiology of the behaviors in question, and then identify the effects of the psychosocial and physical environment on that pathophysiology. So it's not just about neurobiology, it's, again, an integrative approach. And to understand how those systems affect gene expressions, because we now know that genes are not immutable, that we can actually alter the expression of those genes to suppress or express certain traits that can increase or decrease risk for later problems. And then to apply this integrative knowledge to predicting intervention effects. And then, as I said, to elucidate the mechanisms that underlie favorable and unfavorable responders. And importantly, and I said this in my last session, so if you're here again, I'm sorry, is that it's very important not just to look at statistical mediation. We really want to look at things that are malleable. So just because there's a gender or income or demographics or something else as a statistical mediator, we can't change that. And so let's focus on things that we can change, that we can alter and have an impact on once we've, we don't want to just get the publications out there and say, this works and it has a statistical effect and it's a mediation model and it's really nice, and all that. But we really want to do something that has utility, clinical utility, so that we can help to explain more variation in our outcomes on the basis of the mechanisms of change that we're looking at. So we want to look at these, these mechanisms that are malleable, and what we would expect in favorable responders is that these mechanisms would change commensurate with behavioral change. Whether they come before or after, we would expect indices of brain function and development and so forth to change as behavior changes, helping to explain why people are responding well. And then, therefore, we would expect a lack of change in individuals that aren't responding well. It's the intervention. So that helps us to better understand what we're doing and eventually to better target our interventions to affect a greater number of children and families. Developmental neuroscience can help inform this model. We can identify optimal windows of intervention for individuals that have different expressions at different developmental periods of time. And this research can help us determine when individuals are vulnerable or when they're more susceptible in a good way to different kinds of intervention approaches. You don't want to use in a kindergartner what you use in an adolescent. That's obvious, but it really does change, throughout the life course, and so we need to be sensitive to that. And neuroscience can help us to develop these more targeted approaches that target these underlying neurobiological mechanisms of interest. And I think I'll skip a little bit of this because it gets into a little bit too much detail given what I want to use to introduce the other speakers. But we want to see neurobiological change lead to change in self-regulation and then understand what isn't changing so we can target that better. So I said what we still need to do. So that first part of it was we don't know enough. And that's what I want to focus on here, but we do know enough to act. We know enough. We've known enough in the field for actually quite some time. We know what all the major influences are on behavior and health outcomes. We've known them for a long time. So what this panel is really about is what do we do about it? Let's get this information out. What are we waiting for? Let's keep our jobs and still do the research to determine what to make our interventions better and to better understand these mechanisms. But as prevention scientists, each and every one of us has the ultimate goal to improve the quality of life for children and families. And so let's spend at least part of our career really focusing on getting that information out. So at this point in time, very little of what we know in the prevention sciences reaches the public and private sectors. It's a sobering reality, but it's absolutely true. People don't even know what prevention science is, and if you say it, they won't know that it is a science. So they haven't heard the term prevention science, and that there is a science behind it. And so basically, our public health systems, our educational systems, criminal justice policies remain relatively unaffected by the prevention sciences. A recent experience of mine was that we had in our coalition that I'm going to be introducing, we had several people from the Department of Education in our coalition. And I put out some information on mental health, and they came back and said, well, this isn't really relevant to education. So we don't want to get these kinds of distributions. Mental health isn't relevant to education. Okay, so, sorry, I'm very passionate. So even though we actually have the knowledge to exert an impact on a group, community, and population level, very little has been done. These other things, when I talked about mechanisms, is mostly about individual level factors. So the hard facts are, and this is from the Institute of Medicine report, that prevention science is among the most rigorously proven sciences there are for helping humans with social, mental, educational, and medical problems. And this fact is not well known because we don't have billions of dollars for a mass marketing campaign, but we should, because I don't think that there is another science that has more potential to have an impact. From our Promised Neighborhood work, Dennis, our model, all the major influences that we know, and this is obviously just, these are the primary ones, and they cover, each one covers a lot of ground, but our macro level influences, poverty, child labor, homelessness, the social environment, conflict, war, antisocial norms, go on and on, the physical environment, decay in our neighborhoods, toxic exposures, etc. And then the micro level influences, lack of involvement, family level stuff, parenting, school influences, and peer influences. Those are all the major influences. We know a tremendous amount about them, and we still need to research them and understand how individuals are differentially affected by them. But we know enough to do something on a grand scale, to have an impact in all of these domains. I have personal characteristics here because many of them are our mediators. Those are the personal domains that have an effect on how these influences affect the ultimate outcomes for any given person. And these are our primary outcomes, and again, that's only a small number, a number of examples of them. There are many more, but these are the sorts of things that we want to affect. So how can we apply what we know? Several decades of research. Sorry, I just want to get this all up there. Several decades of research have shown that programs that target these ideological underpinnings have the greatest impact for the longest period of time. There are multiple evidence-based programs that exist from the prenatal period throughout adolescence and even into adulthood and they're evidence-based. Let that be the word. They are evidence-based. They're rigorously evaluated and shown to work for a certain subset of people. Most have multiple problems. So I said, most kids that have a certain set of problems frequently have other problems. And there's a lot of evidence to indicate that cardiovascular disease and other things can come later in life as a result of their risk behavior. So the potential lifetime benefits of preventing these problems are greatest with early intervention. But implementation, we've got our implementation scientists here, must be rigorous and sustainable to have lasting effects. And we also know that these interventions are particularly likely to affect disadvantaged children. So of course, they have the furthest to go in terms of the impact that we want to have. But that's where, we do want to focus our efforts there, not to the exclusion of others. So a science to society approach can produce results that really were unimaginable a few decades ago. And we want to rewire. There's evidence that, and we need a lot more studies in this regard, but there's evidence that these programs can rewire the brain in ways that can be very sustainable over time. So what is needed is to we want to infuse a prevention focus. We want to have a prevention mindset in our society. It'll take decades, well beyond the time that I will be on the planet, but it's something that we need to work towards. It's a very important goal to have a shared public vision around prevention. And we need a lot more of a federal presence around these issues and a clear national leadership. So we want to advance our prevention and health promotion approaches on that level, on a federal level, on a state level, and on a local level. So there needs to be a national effort. Some of these are kind of adapted from the IOM report, by the way, so it's not just me saying that this is what's needed. This is there's a consensus around this amongst experts that we really need to have an impact on a federal level to have an impact on communities and families and individuals. And this national effort will require coordination amongst multiple agencies in government. So it's not just about education, it's not just about SAMHSA, it's not just about NIH. It's really going to require a fully integrated effort by all of these agencies. And then we need a translational education, training for our early career investigators and our clinicians and practitioners. And then, of course, further research, which I've already mentioned ad nauseum. So just real quick, if you don't mind going through this very quickly with me, because this is what we're going to be dealing with today. But I've been working with Ty Ridenour and Steve Sussman, just in case any of these names are familiar to you. Steve Sussman and I know I'm forgetting somebody. At any rate, we've been working on adapting the understanding of what translational research is from the basic sciences to prevention. So much of much of the basic sciences have an understanding that there are, 5 or 6 different types of translational research. But it hasn't really been applied to prevention. And most prevention focuses on T2. And so what we're proposing is that we need to go beyond T2. We need to look at the basic research. We have to start with the fundamental process of discovery. We need to get into an understanding of what basic science has to tell us about what is potentially malleable and what the potential mechanisms of interest are, and apply that then to the T2, which is the classical step of research from bedside to practice. It involves the translation of program development to implementation, advocacy trials, and then scaling up to adaptable field studies, effectiveness trials. So that's where SPR and others focus on, but we're trying to pull in the knowledge that we have from all these other translational spectrums. T3 is that we take positive results from T2 and then launch into a practice-oriented phase, which involves field studies that are then translated into adoption and dissemination. At the T4 level, there's global or wide-scale implementation, adoption, and institutionalization of these guidelines that come from the earlier stages of research. So this is where we're really lacking, is that if we have evidence-based programs, if we know the good behavior gain and PAS and Triple P, we know these programs are good. No, they don't reach everybody. We still need to understand more, but they reach quite a few, very important few. And why not institutionalize them? Why not have them as part of the school curriculum, as for example? Why not have Triple P principles infused into the way families function? We need to get to a point where there's a mentality around doing that and a need to do it. It doesn't make anybody any money, and I think that's been part of the problem, but certainly it will save trillions of dollars in the next 10 plus years to infuse these prevention approaches and mentality. And then of course T5 is the back translation as part of the iterative process. So I'm going to introduce the coalition and then we'll get on with things. So we have developed, as a result of a lot of background work, but as a result of an R13 conference grant from NIH, and when I was on the SPR board, I was the task leader for the MAPS 1, which is the T1 task force, and all these things led to a number of activities that brought people together to say, let's formalize our association. And let's go forth and take science to society, basically. And so as our membership, we have scientists from across the disciplinary spectrum all over the country. We have clinicians and practitioners and educators and policymakers and advocates and community organizations. And we're growing, and if anybody's interested, actually, I have some handouts, I forgot. Oh, and there's a bunch of handouts that Taylor put out here that will give you some background, and I have another handout on my center that is now encompassing this. So I have a center called Translational Research for Adversity, Neurodevelopment, and Substance Abuse. It's C-Trans at the University of Maryland School of Medicine that now houses the coalition. And again, the membership is growing. We have a lot of people in the federal government, from NIH to SAMHSA, to some extent the Department of Education, to CDC and ONDCP and OJJDP and so on, who are onlookers and on our list serve. They can't be members, obviously, because they're our grantors, but they're very interested in what we're doing. So these are the sorts of things that we are planning to do. We're already invested in doing it, making a lot of progress. It's just really, the work has been exploding. So we want to, get interdisciplinary teams together, encourage them to use the model that I talked about earlier. We want to advance science-driven practices in communities. We want to build bridges between researchers and these other practitioners and applied individuals. And we want to promote governmental adoption of a prevention model. Knowledge mobilization is what it's all about. This is the Coalition Steering Committee meeting. It's Coalition Steering Committee. If you notice, Ken Jones is my co-chair. He's from the VP of AEKC, which I think is very important because it's a very important community organization, foundation. And so these are the folks that are actually on the steering committee meeting. Will be making decisions about where we go forth. These are some of our accomplishments to date, and I won't go through them all, but we've published a lot. We've got a number of, we've done 2 congressional briefings. which have been extremely well attended. Oh, and I meant to introduce Taylor. I meant to do that in the last slide. Taylor Bishop is the Director of Public Policy for the Coalition, and she's been the whiz behind a lot of what goes on here. So we've done quite a number of things from the research perspective as well as the advocacy perspective to get the word out and to work with the federal government and so on. So I'm going to stop there. We'll do questions later. I just think that's good. So, Will, do you want to get set up? Okay, so Mark Greenburg from Penn State.
Okay, so I told a friend of mine who was in the audience that I was going to give you a PowerPoint today because someone told me that power corrupts and PowerPoints corrupt absolutely. But I ended up doing one because I have a couple visuals. It's really a problem not to deal with, isn't it? So, can you hear me without this? Can you hear me okay? Yeah. Okay, good. So, I'm going to go talk a little bit about T1, I think, which is I'm going to try to sort of do a little bit of going deeper and a little bit of going wider in thinking. And, is this set up? Yeah. So, I'm going to talk about logic models. I think it's all about logic models. Because they should be driving what we're thinking about. And I have to disclose, I'm going to talk about paths for just a second today, so I'm disclosing to you that I receive royalties. So logic models are really important, and I have really a hard time with them. Mine aren't very good, and most of yours are probably not very good either. And that's what science is about, is approximating over time. Think about there's a real territory out there in the world, and these logic models are sort of maps, and they're not very good maps. And the idea is as we do more and more studies of the same thing, our maps should get better. They should get more corresponding to what the real territory is, the reality, right? Because they're not quite reality. A lot of error variance, and problems, and measuring things that aren't really what we exactly want to measure, etc. But I think there's a couple places in translational science that it's important to think about this. And one is in terms of mediators. What do we think is causing our interventions to work? There's way too much black box thinking in prevention science without a lot of actual theorizing about what is causing the changes to occur that we think are occurring. So I've been interested in this kind of problem for quite a while. And Denny mentioned this, the idea of targeting underlying mechanisms that might lead to sustainable change. He called it the engagement of habit learning circuitry. Or you could talk about its changes in neural maturation, especially in the frontal areas. And this could be just maturation. It could be something around the functional aspects of transmitters. And obviously it could also be about myelination, because we're talking about developmental processes. So my first example is an old one. It's 40 years old. Okay? So when I was 9 years old and I was in graduate school, I thought I'll take a course in something I don't know anything about. I was an attachment student of Mary Ainsworth's. But there was a course being taught in neurocognitive measurement of clinical disorders in adults. This is the first book was being written on a handbook of neuropsychology by my teacher. And I took a course on neuropsych assessment of adults, mostly around people that have strokes or in rehabilitation, or they've been in car accidents. And I learned all these old Lurian, Vygotskian, and Wrightanian tests, right? Like the trails and the color form and the clock. And if you're in old neuroscience, this is what we learned. And this is sort of a story about what it means to travel in an interdisciplinary way. This is before the idea of neuroscience. No one was talking about the brain except brain injury, right? There were no MRI machines, there was no decade of the brain, none of that. But there were people out there clinically testing people all the time, and some of them were beginning to do work with kids. Okay? Beginning to do work with kids. And I started doing work with kids where I would go into rehab wards and I'd do neuropsych tests on kids. And of course it was really, as it turned out, fascinating. And it got me thinking about neurocognitive measurement. And as I started doing interventions on emotion regulation, I started bringing back that thinking again, right? And I read Lurie and Vygotsky, very important. Before there was any MRIs, there was Lurie and Vygotsky, and they understood a lot about what they then call the second signal system, or how it is that inhibitory control develops. How does it language and other, we now call executive functions, develop, and why they're powerful, and why they change the nature of human functioning. So I became interested in this, and And then Joachim Fruster wrote a classic book in 1980 called The Frontal Lobes. Anybody ever? It's not bedtime reading. But I decided I'm going to teach a class on the frontal lobes. So in like 1981, I taught a class on the frontal lobes. It was all faculty mostly, rather than graduate students that came to it, because everybody was getting interested in what's going on in the brain. So I decided I would start to do studies where I was doing emotion regulation interventions, and I was also measuring these neurocognitive abilities I thought underlied what I thought was the change, because I was following Vygotsky's ideas that if you use language to regulate behavior and you use motor impulse control to regulate behavior, you can move kids to another developmental level. And that's why in the PAS curriculum we teach kids to do turtle, to stop and calm down, because when they are doing motor regulation, they can't be doing other things, right? And we're linking language to that at the same time. 3, 4, 5, 6-year-olds, 7, and 8-year-olds that have serious problems. So I built this idea in the logic model of PAS back in the 1980s, which was that if my theory was right, that neurocognitive measures should mediate between teaching kids emotion regulation, those would be the program components, self-control and emotion regulation. The mediators would be, one level of mediators would be in the neurocognitive functions, and they would affect outcomes. So what I was really looking at was I thought was developmental maturation of linkages between parts of the prefrontal area and the limbic system, right, the amygdala. And so I gave kids tests back in the 80s like this, the Stroop test, right? And in this case, this is Stroop number 3, in which you have to read the color and not the word. So you have to say green, blue instead of red, orange. That's really hard because you have to inhibit. It's a classic inhibitory control test. We know exactly in the brain of adults what's activated in the ACC. And so I tested it. So I gave the kids, I did a randomized clinical trial with the PAS curriculum. I gave the kids the Stroop test before and afterwards. I gave them the McCarthy perseverative word test. I gave them a bunch of things. I gave them the clock and all kinds of, the Ray Ostrich. Any of you know any of these leaders? All that kind of stuff. And it was a study with 318 regular ed kids, lower working class neighborhoods in the Seattle area, randomized. And here's what I found. I found that, so I did the inhibitory control test. In this case, it's a Stroop test before and afterwards, pre and post, which is fall and spring of 2nd or 3rd grade. And then a year later, we looked at externalizing behavior. By the way, we did not get an effect on externalizing behavior at post-test. And that happens sometimes, because you have to wait in prevention for the control group to begin to have the problem, right? And so what we found was there was a significant effect between PAS intervention and a year later by an independent teacher that was not doing it, children's externalizing behavior problems. We also found, as the theory would say, that PAS affected inhibitory control. In fact, Denny just presented data last hour showing something similar, a motor control effect on the peg tapping test. So the question is now, we know that inhibitory control is related to externalizing behavior. There's lots of studies showing that when you control for IQ, kids, for example, they're delinquent, have much poorer Stroop scores. And what you see is exactly what you hope happened, and that's that inhibitory control is related, these are betas, to the externalizing, but what's important is there's mediation, so that when the Stroop is put in, the inhibitory control method is put in, then the effect, the direct effect of the intervention to externalizing goes non-significant. Okay? And if I substituted the McCarthy word measure, that would show the same thing. And if I substituted internalizing behavior for externalizing behavior, it shows the same thing. And Nate Riggs published this article with me in Prevention Science. Okay? So it's just an example of using theory to go deeper. Now, we could be using different kinds of theories. We could be going genetic, for example. In our lab, we're doing a series of studies where we're looking at gene by treatment interactions. I don't think those are very usable in case that we're not planning on doing personalized medicine with kids now. We're screening for their genes to give them interventions, and I'm not advocating that. But I am advocating that we understand how our interventions work, right, and who they work for, better or worse. So that's an example of translation science, just to give you a feel for one way of thinking about this, and that's really about the issue of the mediators. But just as important is the outcomes, because I think we think in really limited ways about our outcomes. Our outcomes, of course, are often limited in our grant writing by our agencies, but they're also limited by our lack of interdisciplinary thinking, right? So I'm looking at Lori, who's here, who broke through that, where she showed that her behavioral parenting intervention for high-risk kids affected obesity, right? So I've been thinking about the same thing the last couple of years. Tish Jennings and I and other people have been doing mindfulness interventions with adults, mostly with teachers. And we've been doing it for a while, and we've been showing in trials that it can improve teachers, reduces their burnout, and reduces their depressive symptoms, and improves their classroom efficacy as they're liking teaching more. And that's all good. And that's what the educational funders want. They want us to show that it's affecting the classroom processes, and ultimately it's affecting student outcomes. Okay? But that's maybe not in the long run where the real gold is here. The real gold may not be in the outcomes in the classroom or the outcomes for the kids. It may be the outcomes in the teachers themselves. So recently, we began to study the health outcomes of teachers. And without getting into any detail about it, because I don't have time, we did an intervention trial, which was a daily yoga intervention done for 16 weeks with teachers voluntarily coming to the school, and all the data will be presented in a symposium on Friday. But what we found was, and that's been our model, that's our pro-social classroom model. You see the outcomes, student outcomes, a healthy classroom climate. We never thought about the teachers themselves, except are they less depressed so they'll teach better? So now we're actually measuring their health outcomes. First thing we found is there are significant effects in all three trials in their report of daily physical symptoms. Okay? Now we don't know how that translates into how many drugs they're using, right? But we know that a very high percentage of teachers are on depressive medication, on SSRIs. Okay? Dennis is nodding his head. It's estimated in Wisconsin between 25 and 30% of teachers every day are on depressive medication. To give you a sense of the magnitude, it's about double the normal population for females. So then we started looking at other things. So we just a very simple measure, but we didn't think it wasn't in our logic model, you see, and that's systolic blood pressure. And this is the intervention control difference, which is at the 0.01 level between the intervention and control teachers that got this daily yoga intervention. And in fact, the more they came, the more effect this had. It's true just in the trial overall. And lastly, we presented a little bit of this earlier today. This is their cortisol waking response in the intervention and the control group. And without getting into any detail about it, what you can see is the intervention teachers have a sharper rise in awakening morning cortisol, which is a healthy response. And the control teachers have that same response at pre-test at the beginning of the year, but at the end of the year they have a flattened response. Okay? So now that shifts the policy completely. Now I'm not starting to think about, am I going to get funded by IES, but now I'm thinking about the National Institute of Heart, Lung, and Blood. Right? See how it opens up the perspective. And now I'm not thinking about trying to convince school districts to pay for this because it affects student outcomes, but instead as employee assistance, because it's estimated to cost about $30,000 every time you get a new teacher. Every loss of a teacher costs a school district an average of $50,000. That's a big cost. So if we can reduce attrition and healthcare costs, which are fixed costs for school districts, come from our taxes, right? These may be more important outcomes than the ones that were in my logic model, our logic model. So this is just a plea for us all to think more broadly about our work. And that's what T1 work should do. It should expand both the depth of the sort of mediational processes we understand, and it should expand the breadth of sort of the outcomes that we are thinking about studying. 13 minutes. Okay?
Formal about the coalition today. I'll probably just hang out there starting at 5 o'clock at the bar. I won't be drinking. But, you know, if you would like to know more about the coalition, Taylor and I will be at the bar next to the restaurant on the lobby level.
Well, you just stole everything, I mean, because that's the most important thing. I mean, I don't know how I can call it a bar. So I'm Will Aldridge at the National Implementation Research Network, UNC Chapel Hill, part of Frank Program Child Development Institute. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how do we take that science, that basic, that intervention science, and actually implement it in real-world settings and then scale it at large. And I'll say that this science is really a product, what I'm going to share with you is really a product of our entire group, kind of our collective looking at this, our synthesis of the implementation of research and our use of it in the field with organizations and agencies. So to get us started, this is our interactive portion of the program. We're going to do a couple of program choices here, and I want you to tell me, for I'm looking at some of you, you may not yet have kids. Some of you may have kids, but for your families, which would you choose? Would you choose program A or program B? So here's a school behavioral health program. Let's see if Mark recognizes some of this data. It's looking at percent reduction in aggression. Where do you go? Program A, program B?
B.
B. Good choice. All right. Well done. Okay, here's an employment program in an adult mental health setting. So would you go with program A or program B in terms of the outcomes of percent employed?
B.
B. All right. We're sticking with B. Not a bad trend. Adult substance abuse treatment. This is looking at percent clean urine screens after coming through this program. Where would you like to see your family members? Program A or program B?
B.
B. Sticking to your guns. All right. Brilliant. Because here's the thing. In each of those slides, program A and program B are the exact same program. So how in the world would you look at that? And program A looks PATS, by the way, some real PATS data. So it's nice to have Mark on this panel. A was actually a low fidelity implementation of the program, and B was a high fidelity implementation of the program. What do I mean by fidelity? Well, simply that the core components, the active ingredients of that intervention are actually in place and being used as intended. So my first point is really that we need, when we take this science out into the real world, we need it to be usable. Usable interventions have a few different criteria. This has been published by my colleagues, Dean Dixon and Karen Wazzi, recently. But not only do we need a clear description of what the program is, you'll quite often see that, we also need to identify what those core active ingredients are. There's been some meta-analyses looking at treatment outcome literature that share that about 18% of treatment outcome studies actually measure the active ingredients when they're being researched, and only about 7% actually go through analyses to associate the active ingredients with outcomes. And we've really got to get that up, because once we have those core ingredients identified, they can be operationalized, and that helps practitioners and systems learn what they should do, what they should say, how they should interact with their clients. And certainly, we're able to develop fidelity assessments off of that so that we have a way to know whether the program is actually being implemented as intended if those core ingredients are there. Okay, so that's my quick bit on how do we get from kind of the basic and the interventions into implementation. It needs to be usable. But what about the potential for using interventions at scale? There are some case studies of this. This is last month, Triple P in North Carolina. They're in 34 counties now. They've trained, since the last month, 677 practitioners, which is a pretty sizable amount. One of the things I like about this is it shows some blended funding and how they're actually rolling these out at the county level. They're still in year 2, year 3 of that, so they don't have outcome data yet. But here's one that does have some outcome data, because it was a little bit earlier. This is wraparound services for some of the most difficult youth and mental health settings in Kansas. You see a scale up in terms of the number of children that are being served from 1998 to 2004. And lo and behold, we see a decrease in some unfavorable outcomes. The number of days these children are spending institutionalized, and the percent of children that actually end up institutionalized as well. So that's quite nice. All right, here's another example. Functional family therapy in Washington State. So this is prevention of recidivism for juvenile offenders. What you're looking at here is you're actually looking at 25 therapists, functional family therapists, and their caseloads, and the percent of their caseloads that are actually coming back into the juvenile system. Well, if we look at it against the control bar, which is our lowest, the control group had about 22%. You look at this distribution and you say, well, that distribution is not so far off from the control group. But we can actually make a meaningful distinction here, because these first 12 therapists were actually therapists that were highly competent, that were meeting fidelity criteria. And their recidivism rate, 13%. Now the bottom group were therapists who were not meeting, they were not using the intervention as intended, and they have a 25% recidivism rate. So in this case, hey, it's an evidence-based program or practice, and the outcomes were actually worse than the control group. So again, even when we do this at a population level, we still need to know whether that fidelity is there. And we think we know, we think that that's kind of generally the pattern when things roll out and go to scale. You get kind of a hodgepodge of results, and it's difficult to figure out what's going on. But we think we generally know. This is from a couple of longitudinal studies of comprehensive school reforms. And when these programs, these interventions were developed, of course, every teacher in their search trials were trained, every teacher was continually supported after training. And when they followed the rollout of these comprehensive school reforms over time, they started to see in years 1 through 3, only about 50% of the teachers were actually getting training. Fewer than 25% of teachers were actually being supported to use the comprehensive school reform strategies after they got training. And then in year 4 and 5, less than 10% of those teachers were actually using the strategies as intended, and therefore the vast majority of these students were not benefiting. And this is an initiative that's in over 8,000 schools. Our federal government has spent over $2 billion on, and yet it's not adequately being supported from an implementation context, and we don't know whether or not students are actually getting much benefit. So does anybody know what this picture is of, what this phenomenon is called? What is it, Dennis?
I can't remember we don't have that anymore in Arizona.
Yes, you do see it in the Southwest. This is Virga. This is when it starts to rain, but the rain does not hit the ground. And this is what generally is going on, not just with prevention science, but with intervention science across human services. So we're creating these great big, wet, heavy raindrops, and yet they're not reaching the ground to nurture the soils to have the intended effects. And the reason is because most of our traditional methods of getting these interventions out there are not successful. Our traditional methods for dissemination and implementation are not successful. This goes from everything from diffusion, just letting it happen, to dissemination, or actually kind of helping it happen, maybe providing some training. I mean, we've all heard, spray and pray, train and hope, all those kind of things. Passing laws and mandates, doing these sorts of things, even providing incentives. At best, a synthesis of the research shows it results in about 5 to 15% of the intended outcomes. They are necessary because you have to get the word out, but they are not near sufficient to do implementation, particularly at scale. Mostly because these are push strategies. It is push, push, push. And where we're going when we go into real-world settings is we're going into very complex human service systems. My favorite quote of these is the one on top. Spencer Darling is a business expert that says, all organizations, wittingly or unwittingly, are designed to get exactly the results that they're getting. Right? And so we expect, if we want to get different results, what do we need to do? We need to adapt and change the system if we want to expect something different. And I also like this last one, I like all of them, I wouldn't put them up there, but systems trump programs. You put this program in there, and boy, that system will crush it from the different forces that are acting within it. And so it's almost like we're dropping these strategies into these organizations, and we're expecting a miracle to occur. And we need to actually get a little bit more explicit and figure out a better way through this. So the last half of my talk is really talking about a new approach, moving from letting it happen and even helping it happen to actually strategies to make it happen. And this is really my third point, I think. Yeah, my third point. And this is the starting point. This is the formula for success. We need the effective interventions. We need the basic science, the intervention science. That helps us choose where to put our money, what's going to be effective, which interventions to invest in. We also need effective implementation methods to actually adapt the social services context to effectively use, to support the full and effective use of those strategies. And we need to create enabling contexts, learning organizations that can onboard these strategies, put in data systems, and improve their use over time. They don't become stagnant. And if we combine all three of these, this is how we're actually going to reach the socially significant outcomes that we're all after. And of course, this is not addition, this is multiplication, because anything times 0 is 0, right? So you can have the most effective program in the world. If it's poorly implemented, then that system will crush it and we won't get the intended outcomes. So my colleagues at NERM, the National Implementation Research Network, started about 10 years ago with the William T. Grant Foundation funding to pull together all of the implementation research, from prevention to education to child welfare to health to business to agriculture, and look, well, what are the effective strategies for implementing technology and science in real-world settings? And we've been continuing to update this synthesis of the literature, not necessarily in the publication, but in terms of what we're seeing and how we're making sense of it over time, and as we've been actively working with systems and agencies globally to make use of these strategies. You can actually go, I'm not going to spend time going through all these on my time, and may bore you anyway, but you can actually go, we have an e-learning hub now. It's implementation.fpg.unc.edu, and you can actually spend time learning about these different frameworks in a way that you can actually help make sense of them. But what I do want to share is, what does this actually look like in a community? How do they take this implementation science, and what do they do with it in terms of building capacity to actively implement these programs? There's a few things that happen. Number one, there typically needs to be some sort of executive authority or leadership role that is tasked with creating opportunities for change in these systems and managing that change when it's underway. There's also a design function that ends up happening where you have stakeholders from across the system that can take that 30,000-foot view, that can align and de-silo a lot of the initiatives that are going on, and that can help communicate important messages to all aspects of the community or system. And lastly, and perhaps most importantly, is this day-to-day management and coordination function. These are the people who are actually, and we ask organizations to fund these people, to repurpose, rewrite their job descriptions. Half-time, full-time would be best, where they are day-to-day ensuring the implementation, and I'll show you what that means in a second, of these strategies, their help to create a hospitable environment and to engage the community. And of course, it's not all about change. An important, very important aspect of doing this community work is taking the history and the traditions of that community and wrapping them up and carrying them with you as you march forward, taking this new science and particularly making it their own. And we have some evidence that these implementation teams add a lot of value. We know that the general pattern of moving science to society takes about 17 years for 14% of the science to actually have an impact, to actually get out there. Well, the little bit of science that we've got so far on implementation teams suggests that if we have a usable intervention, we can actually get that science scaled to about 80% of our targets in as little as 3.5 years. So it can radically provide a boost, and not only shorten time and increase target, but also sustainability. This is actually from that same study, but if you look at where organizations are spending their money, if it's not only on practitioner development, if it's also in investing in these organization or system supports, they are much more likely to still be operating 6 years plus after they get going. And so I told you I was going to tell you, well, what does this ensuring implementation look like? Well, there's core intervention components. We call these implementation drivers that have to be in place in a community, in a system. There are things like recruitment and selection, using best practices where you're doing behavioral interviews of your potential service providers, training providers with adult learning best practices that actually actively involve the learners, doing coaching to criteria for fidelity, but also competent coaching, doing the fidelity assessment itself, and then also putting into place these decision support data systems so that communities can get data. The data doesn't end when the publication comes out. Data has to continually be collected. Businesses do this, health systems do this, communities have to do this as well. And we've got some evidence as well. My colleague Allison Metz was part of this work. She's actually presenting this data tomorrow in the third invited symposium. So if you're intrigued by this, come see her presentation. Brian's on that as well, so you can see him again. And we've got some evidence. If we look, these are, you see our drivers on the left over here. This scale is 0 to 2. 0 is not in place, 1 is partially in place, 2 is fully in place. If you look at our time 1, this is a child welfare intervention. Those drivers, 1.1 composite, partially in place. And look at our fidelity scores. Okay? Time 2, times 3, there was active strategies to actually build these implementation drivers over time, boosted up to 1.68, 1.83, and look at the association with the jump in fidelity. So we know if we're building these drivers that we're actually going to affect the fidelity. And then lastly, what does it look like to create a hospitable environment? Well, we need these linked implementation teams. We need these drivers of implementation, but there's also a certain culture shift. There's certain strategies that the entire community, the entire system shares. These are doing things like changing policies and practices, administration policies and practices, to actively support the strategies that are being put in place. Intervening in the larger service system, from mental health to the education, getting the schools involved, to state and county policy and laws. So getting involved in that as well. Doing adaptive leadership. If anybody's read Ron Heifetz's stuff out of Harvard, really interesting things on dealing with tensions and the politics and the difficult changes that these communities have to make. Certainly using data for decision making and engaging in continuous quality improvement, and taking a stage-based approach. It doesn't happen all at once. It takes about 2 to 4 years. Well, you may say, all right, well, that is a lot. And communities tell me that. I'm working with a group out in California, and I did that, and wow, that is a lot to do. Who ends up helping lay the groundwork for that? It's a partnership. If we want to create these implementation infrastructures and best practices, we need the local communities. We need the key stakeholders there. We also need funders and policymakers, particularly ones that are willing to invest in planning and exploration activities that don't say from day one you've got to start serving, that actually continue to fund throughout the full 2 to 4 years it takes to scale up something. We need the program developers and the purveyors because they have the interventions expertise, and quite often there's a need for expert implementation technical assistance. They're able to actually create these systems level changes. When we have all of those together, that's when we're actually able to create visible infrastructure for implementation. So that's the end of what I've got. If you want any follow-up information, feel free to let us know. So thanks so much.
Good afternoon, everyone. I think I am going to use the microphone. I've had laryngitis for the last 2 days, so see if I can get through this. So we're going to continue down this or up this translational spectrum. Again, I'm Brian Bumbarger. I'm with the Prevention Research Center at Penn State University. And for about the last 5 years, I've been directing an organization called the Evidence-Based Prevention and Intervention Support Center, focused on scaling up a group of evidence-based programs, essentially the blueprints list, the blueprints for what started as the blueprints for violence prevention for the most part. And I want to sort of wrap us back around here by talking mostly about scaling. So how many of you, when you entered grad school to become future prevention scientists, if they had said, well, you're mostly just going to write a lot of papers, you're not really going to make a lot of people better. You'll get some grants. You might get to work on a beautiful college campus. You're not really going to help many people. How many of you would have signed up for that? Right? So we're all in the business to try to help people. We want this ultimately, we want all of our prevention science to eventually result in public health improvement, hopefully public health improvement that can be measured at the population level, right? That's what we want to get at. So I'm going to talk about really some big, hairy, audacious ideas for what maybe is the next generation of what prevention science should and might look like. How do we kick this thing up a notch to try to get to scaling for impact, but scaling for impact in a way that might be efficient and cost effective. So, we have reason to be optimistic. It's not all misery here. We don't really just publish a bunch of articles, right? We are helping people. We are moving the needle in important ways on important things. And when I think about something like these online registries of effective programs, think about NREP or crimesolutions.gov or the blueprints for healthy youth development, the fact that we have online searchable registries, well, first of all, it indicates that we have effective interventions. It indicates that we have so many effective interventions that we can actually create registries of them. That we have such diverse effective interventions that we have to have search terms to find the right ones that match our distinct needs. So so think about all of the basic science that had to have happened to inform the hypotheses about the etiology of different behavioral or health outcomes, first of all. So you have to do basic, T0, basic bench science to inform your understanding of the etiology of the problem, and then based on that knowledge, develop some hypotheses about how you could intervene in that etiological development to prevent or reduce that problem behavior, and then develop an intervention to test your hypothesis about your theories of behavior change. Then develop interventions, take them out, efficacy test them, effectiveness test them. So there's a whole lot of science that had to have taken place over the last 40, 50 years to get us to the place where we have online registries because we have so many effective interventions. But as Denny mentioned in the very beginning, and I think Mark alluded to also, a lot of these are still pretty black box. We really, and Will mentioned, the core critical components. We don't know exactly how some of these interventions work. We know we got a main effect on an important outcome that we're interested in. So there still is a lot more basic science to be done, unpacking those. Certainly there's much more basic science around in terms of neuroscience that we need to do. So we need to continue to build our knowledge base. But as Denny said, we do know a lot, and we can make more progress in moving to scale what we know already works. So there's reason for optimism because of the amount of science that's behind these registries, but there's also some legitimate reason for pessimism. We can all probably name some things that don't have any science behind them at all, that are in really widespread use, that don't have to be on registries, and somehow they end up in every school and every community, right? So that's what we're up against. But we have made progress, and I don't want this to be a story about, we're not making any difference. So I want to just quickly talk about what we've done in Pennsylvania over the last nearly 20 years in trying to scale up some of these effective interventions, because it does demonstrate that we can actually do this. We can scale up, and we can move the needle on important outcomes that we can measure at the community or population level. So Pennsylvania was one of the states that originally invested in the development of the blueprint programs to create one of the first lists of evidence-based programs. And so Pennsylvania was really literally invested in making use of that list. So in 1998, the Pennsylvania Commission on Crime and Delinquency started actively trying to encourage communities to adopt these evidence-based programs by providing grant funds. And to do that in Pennsylvania, to disseminate these effective programs, we first went around the state and we implemented the Communities That Care model for data-driven strategic prevention planning. And so what we did was we built the capacity of local communities to collect data on the known risk and protective factors that were most prevalent in their community in order to inform their decisions about how they could use the programs that are on these registries. Again, think about that. Think about the science behind that process. Think about the prevention science that was necessary to elucidate, to enumerate a specific list of risk and protective factors that are statistically associated with these poor outcomes that we're trying to address. So that's critical. But what do you do with that knowledge? It's not enough to just, do epidemiological and etiological studies to identify these risk and protective factors. There was a step in there that had to be about packaging that knowledge, packaging that research in a way that created some usable tools for communities. There had to be youth surveys developed so that communities could collect the information in their local community to create a profile like you see up here so that they could not only have a process for surveillance of risk factors in their communities, but so that they could use that information in a way that would drive decision-making and resource allocation in their community. So we use that infrastructure of Communities That Care to build this capacity in local communities to make good decisions about program selection. And the result was that we disseminated about 300 replications of evidence-based programs around Pennsylvania over the last about 15 years. And in a number of studies that we've done in Pennsylvania, we've been able to demonstrate that in communities that adopted this combination of data-driven strategic prevention planning, using this data about the known risk and protective factors, and using that data then to make decisions about selecting and implementing well-matched evidence-based programs, we've been able to demonstrate that those communities have lower rates of delinquency, they have better academic achievement and school engagement, the kids in those communities have better peer-resistant skills, and we've been able to measure systems utilization in those communities and seen that those communities are putting fewer kids in residential out-of-home delinquency placement. So we're impacting kids and we're impacting systems. So that's a story about how to demonstrate that yes, we can go from basic T0 science about what are the risk and protective factors that are statistically associated with these outcomes, all the way to the end of the story where we've taken that and scaled it up to the point where we're moving the needle on these kind of population level and systems level outcomes. The challenge though is that this took like tens of millions of dollars and nearly 20 years to do. So again, going back to the title of my presentation, can we get to the point where we're scaling up in a more efficient and cost-effective way? One of the barriers that we're struggling with right now is that we've developed this knowledge and we've developed these interventions, but we don't necessarily have the concomitant capacity in communities or in government to make good use of the research that we produce as prevention scientists. So one important point, innovation without capacity is of limited use. If we develop really, and this is really the conundrum about about the need to both continue to push basic science and to get more sophisticated in our thinking about the complexities of these interventions. Well, the more sophisticated we get about our understanding of the complexity of the problems and the etiology, that means our interventions are likely to get more sophisticated and likely to get more complex, which makes them even less likely to be seen as acceptable to communities. So when as we continue to increase our understanding of the complexity of the problems and develop more precise interventions, we have to be mindful that there has to be capacity building that's going to have to go along with that to make sure that those interventions are actually usable. In Pennsylvania, we've done this, or we've addressed some of this by developing what we call a state-level intermediary organization, the Epicenter, as an infrastructure to address the current disconnect between what is conventionally seen as this sort of armamentarium of evidence-based programs, as opposed to what are the capacities of the provider organizations that are ultimately responsible for delivering these interventions. The Epicenter as a state-level intermediary organization, essentially, it only has to exist because what we currently have in terms of effective interventions are not a very good fit with the capacities of organizations and communities that need these interventions. So we're, at some level, the Epicenter is in the business of pounding square pegs through round holes. I mean, we're there to basically to troubleshoot and figure out how to make these things that don't quite fit or are more complex and more expensive to still get communities to adopt and implement these interventions. Another issue that we're struggling with is, the whole problem of too much push and not enough pull. It's amazing to me how little some programs or strategies how little they have to try to get themselves into communities. I mean, things that have been proven ineffective that we can't get out of communities, and yet the things that have this evidence of these interventions that have strong evidence of effectiveness, it seems to be such an effort to push these into communities. And so it makes you think about what is driving the push versus pull. And we really have been putting all our eggs in the push basket for the last 20 years probably. And we haven't been thinking about how do we build the capacities of local providers and local service delivery organizations and schools and nonprofits to be prepared to deliver these more sophisticated and yet more effective types of interventions so that they will be more likely to want to pull those effective programs into their organizations because they know they work and they can experience that. Part of the push versus pull dilemma is that inconvenience trumps effectiveness. So, we continue to buy into this myth that proving that something works is going to be what it takes to get communities to do it. Jim Emshoff published an article, I don't know, it must have been maybe 4 years ago now, in the American Journal of Community Psychology, a special issue, where he talked about this whole idea of if you build it, they will come. We used to think that if we just told people which programs were effective, they would rush out there and get those programs and they would stop doing all of the other things. And we know that that isn't the truth, and a big part of that is because the things that are effective are not necessarily convenient. And so the reality that we're facing is that communities are choosing convenience over effectiveness. And that is especially easy to do when there is no decision data support. Is that the right?
Decision support data.
Decision support data infrastructure. If a community or an organization doesn't regularly assess, just as a part of their ongoing current practice, if they don't assess whether what they're doing is making any difference or not, it's much easier to choose what's convenient over what's effective, because you don't know whether what you're doing is effective or not. And then you can assume that it is. And part of this inconvenience trumps effectiveness is that our communities right now, I mean, this has been our experience, communities view the most effective interventions as these unnecessarily complex Rube Goldberg machines, right? You know what a Rube Goldberg machine is? Remember that old game Mousetrap, right? Well, that's sort of how communities see these interventions, especially when we, as the prevention researchers and the developers of the programs, we can't unpack the black box. We've created all of these things, all of these moving parts, because the reality is we created all these moving parts because originally we were just trying to prove a hypothesis, right? So when you're trying to prove a hypothesis about a theory of behavior change, you turn all the dials up to 11 and you throw in everything but the kitchen sink. The problem is, after we prove that hypothesis, there usually isn't a set of next steps where we then optimize the intervention. We streamline it down and we make it as cheap and simple as possible. That part of the research and development sequence is mostly missing in prevention science. I'm overgeneralizing, but so that raises the question then, does innovation for scale look more like this? Does it look like an app on your cell phone rather than an 18-lesson curriculum that has 5 binders and a 3-day training? Does everybody know what this app is? Probably half of you have this app on your phone, right? You do, right? How many days of training did you go to use this app?
30 seconds.
30 seconds, right. Right. So this is, thinking about the next generation of preventive interventions. Is this what we need to get more of? Do we need to be moving more in this direction? It's not going to be, this isn't going to be a panacea. We won't be able to develop a cell phone app for every problem that we're trying to, and I'm not advocating that we, stop doing curricular programs, but we need to think about the reason that half of you have this app on your phone. And we need to think about the reason that most of you who have this app on your phone probably are using it pretty effectively, right? And what makes it effective and what makes it easy for you to do without all this concern about fidelity and implementation quality, and what are the core essential components of this cell phone app. The other piece that I want to talk about that I think is a real barrier and challenge to us getting to scale effectively and cost effectively and efficiently is that we need much more focus on the macro system. When we think about prevention science as a body, if you pull out your program for the SPR conference this year or any year, and you look through and you look at every presentation that happens in this conference, and you try to place it in this ecological model, where's the focus? There's probably, I don't know, I would guess there's probably 80% of the focus is on the microsystem, right? And and we all talk about, it's not that we're not aware of the barriers that are created in the macro system. It's just that we're not doing much about it. It's just like we just kind of shrug our shoulders and say, well, you know, there's all that policy and stuff out there that, you know, that ultimately gets in the way of our interventions being effective or scaling up. And we are doing some things about it. Obviously, we're working in that area, but I think the reality is that our progress in prevention science, if you think about mapping our progress across all the areas of this ecological model, it's pretty idiosyncratic, right? And you know, as a society of research professionals, we could probably be more strategic about thinking about how to put more emphasis on the macro system to address some of these system barriers. And I'll use this same quote because it hits the nail right on the head. The road to scale runs through public systems. And this is the truth. So we experience this. We develop really good, effective interventions that don't fit the systems, right? And then we try to develop these workarounds to try to get these effective, because we know they're effective, and it just seems logical that the systems should accept the most effective interventions, but that's not the truth, because the reality is the systems that exist were developed before there was any science, or there was an evidence base.
How we doing? We really late.
All right, so, I'll speed through this. So then, with that caveat in mind, maybe innovation for scale looks more like this. How many of you have seen this funding announcement? Right. So this is about testing innovative healthcare payment and service delivery systems. That's a very different angle on prevention science than we've traditionally been focused on, but this is really what needs to happen. We need to develop innovative healthcare payment and service delivery models. Just a last plug to remember Rogers' diffusion of innovation theory. We seem to have left that behind at some point. We all read it at some point in grad school and then we forgot it. There are a number of strategies for the diffusion of innovation, and I think when it comes time to actively diffuse our innovations, we forget about carefully selecting the model for diffusion of innovation that best fits the context. So just some last recommendations: better and more sophisticated data systems, a greater focus on capacity building at scale. We need to establish, in the field of prevention science, we really need to establish a distinct intervention, optimization, and delivery infrastructure that's separate from the conventional system of discovery and innovation. And we're getting there with smart designs and adaptive designs, but we need an infrastructure to do that, or it's not going to develop rapidly enough. Research to change systems that were developed before there was a prevention science, and getting back to the prevention coalition idea, for prevention science to achieve impact, we really need partners outside of prevention research. Thank you.
For anybody, I know the session's not over, but does anybody have any burning questions or items for discussion? Yes?
So one quick plug, if you're interested in learning how to do more applied research that would inform this conversation, I would strongly encourage people to look at the SRCD Policy Fellowship, because you can get placed in an agency like mine that's doing research at scale and learn how to think that way. The second thing I would just say is that we're also thinking a lot about external validity, which is not really explicitly discussed here, but really prevention science is to start documenting who are clearly our populations, our settings, and how much do we actually believe we can extrapolate this to other populations and settings
Absolutely.
to help communities make these
Yeah,
decisions.
absolutely. It's all part of scaling up and a lot of issues that are very pertinent here. Yeah.
Then,
Yes, Dennis.
I have a comment about how to explain being a prevention scientist. Tell people that you're a prevention scientist and watch the blank looks. So I
Right.
have to do this all the day because I make my living. Okay, so make a short list of all the good things that you want to, well, I could make a short list of all the good things that you want to have happen to the people you care about in your life. Make a short list of all the bad things that you don't want to have happen to the people you care about in your life. I can help you as a licensed clinician. I don't do that. What I do is do that for whole states, counties, and even nations. And people say, wow, never heard about that. That's cool. So you gotta have a 25-word way of
Right.
explaining what
Right,
we
yeah,
do.
we need the elevator speech.
Can I get that on video later?
Anybody else want to say that? I hope that the whole T0